If you were mixing a song on one of these bad boys, the level you sent audio to it would matter a great deal. Record too quiet and you'd have to boost the gain up afterwards, increasing the loudness of the noise floor, making the signal noisier. Record too loud, however, the analog circuitry inside the desk would start to distort, introducing unwanted saturation to the signal. And while sometimes this was a desirable effect that we try to now emulate these days, in most cases it ruined the audio quality. This is where gain staging was important. You had to make sure you weren't clipping before you recorded the final mix to tape or whichever medium. Now in digital terms, this meant recording things at roughly negative 18 dB full scale, which is super quiet by these days standards. However, most people these days are mixing on one of these bad boys. And for the most part, all that analog stuff you just learned about, we can throw out the window. Now, for those of you who are about to punch your computer, take it easy. I'll be explaining some of the exceptions to this idea of throwing it all out the window later in the video. But it is worth mentioning that if you're newer to music production, gain staging is important to get right early. But it's not the only thing, and there are definitely more important concepts you should get right first. We cover all of these in our free new producer roadmap masterclass, which over 10,000 producers have signed up for. So if you're interested in nailing the basics of music production from the get-go, sign up down below at our link, edmprod.com/free-masterclass. For now, let's strap in because we're about to nerd out about gain staging. So I like to define gain staging as managing the loudness of your audio to ensure its maximum quality. And in most cases, this means avoiding noise and distortion. And it applies at every point in the signal chain, from the thing that's generating the sound, whether it's a sample, synth, or recording, to the processing that's being applied to that sound, to the fader level and the routing, including any groups you're going through, and also including the processing going on from a mastering perspective. However, gain staging is normally best sorted out from the get-go, so you really want to get your source material at a good volume because it makes everything easier to work with. Again, you want to record, design, or sample a sound at an appropriate volume, because to use a classic analogy, you can't polish a turd. If it's bad from the start, it's going to be bad the whole way down. From there, you also want to make sure that your processing and routing and boosting and all sorts of signal chain effects are not drastically affecting or altering the loudness of your sound, because this is just going to cause you headaches down the line. Now, we'll be talking about how certain types of plugins affect gain staging towards the end of the video, so make sure you stick around. So now that we understand what gain staging is, I want to talk about digital headroom. The common idea in digital audio is that as long as it's not hitting over 0 dB, then you're sweet. And this is also true when your audio is exported into one of the major formats, MP3, WAV, AAFF, or whichever. However, I do want to say things are a little different inside the modern DAW. Ableton Live, FL Studio, and Logic Pro X, and basically every modern DAW have headroom built into each individual track or each individual channel. Although the fader only shows a negative infinity to 0 resolution, the reality is that most of the headroom built into these individual channels exceeds 0 dB. This means you can clip the channel without actually introducing any distortion. We can test this. I've got my analog synth loaded up here in Ableton. Let me turn off all the processing for now, and I can just play it here. Sounds good, right? Pretty basic. But you can see, it's kind of peaking around negative 12 at the moment. What I want to do is absolutely crank the volume. I'm actually going to add 35 dB of gain here, and we're going to push that over 0 dB. We're going to compensate by turning it down on a master so we don't hurt all of our ears, and we can actually see the effect in action. Now, you'll notice when I play, the fader is clipping like crazy, but our master is not. It's around that negative 12 again, right? And what's going on here is, even though it should be distorting and sounding terrible on this synth, the master turns it down back to where it was. And the reality is I can boost up into these channels by 60 dB before I'll get any sort of clipping. And this allows great flexibility for me when I'm managing my loudness, working and being creative in the studio. It means I don't have to freak out about this specific strict analog workflow. In other DAWs, this applies too. I've got a bunch of fruity balances on FL Studio here, and with a kick drum, we'll never peak. Same thing here in Logic Pro. I have a drum kit being boosted by actually over 100 dB here. We've got 5 all doing 25 dB of gain, and then 5 down 24 dB each on the master with no loss of quality. So to sum this all up, what really matters is that you don't want to exceed 0 dB on the master. Clipping only matters if it's on the final export and if it's on the final channel that's going to be bounced out. And now, as mentioned, in the analog realm, turning up a sound usually meant you're boosting the noise, and turning it down wasn't an option if it had already clipped on the recording. But in electronic music, we're working with samples, synths, and things like that that don't have these problems. In most cases, you can turn a sound up or down 1,000,000 times without any loss of quality. Now, obviously, there is still a limit in Ableton at 60 dB. I'll still, for example, be able to play this, but if I do it once more, so one more lot of 35, you start to hear the distortion become introduced there, right? So there is a limit still. But for the most part, turning something up and down doesn't destroy the audio quality. And the benefit of this, again, is that you can be more creative with your production work, turn things up, boost the limiter, turn up the gain down without worrying about how that's going to affect your end result. Again, as long as nothing goes over 0 dB on the final master here, then you're good. And even then, if you're exporting anything above 0 dB, you can actually use a format called 32-bit float, which allows you to bounce things out above 0 dB with no loss of quality, which is pretty cool. Not compatible with a lot of formats. In the final version, you definitely want to be exporting at 24-bit eventually, but when you're working between sessions, it's a great option and you'll still be able to retain the fidelity. Even then, if I am exporting anything like stems on my individual channels, obviously then the 0 dB amounts do become relevant, because I don't want to make sure when they're exported that this individual channel is going to clip, because it will do that when we export it, but not when we hear it in Ableton. So you can also then just go ahead, if it's above 0 dB, chuck a utility on and turn it down and you're fine. So a lot of you may be thinking now, wait, shouldn't I have things peaking at -6 dB on my master? Like, that's kind of the thing I should aim for, right, when I'm gain staging. Again, if you're mixing your instruments around the -18 dBFS range, which is ideal for an analog workflow, you'll likely max out at -6 dB on the master. And we can see that this thinking and result actually comes from the analog days. It's not inherently bad, but it's just not necessary in the digital environment. There's no loss of quality by turning things up or down. A mastering engineer could receive a pre-master at -18, -20, and simply just grab a utility and turn it up. There's no problem. Again, the only thing that matters here is that it's exported under 0 dB in a format where there's no clipping. Now, while labels and stuff like that will ask for -6 dB pre-masters just to ensure that they're getting consistent quality, it's fine. If you haven't mixed to that standard though, again, adjust the utility so that your master starts peaking at -6 and you can go from there. So all of this begs the question. We don't have to abide by the analog gain staging workflow, but even then, what's so bad about it? Isn't it still a good idea to abide by? And these were my thoughts exactly as a producer who wanted to achieve an analog type sound in my mixes. I wanted it to have that warmth that other mixes seem to have, to which I would say it really depends on the style and type of music you're wanting to make. For example, if I'm making a loud dubstep track, loudness is crucial to the sonic character of the style I'm going for. Mixing at -18 dBFS on my faders probably doesn't make sense. I'm using limiting, loudness, compression, clipping to achieve a full fat mix. And the thing is, new sounds and genres have actually been invented by breaking the analog rules. That's how we've got dubstep, trap, drum and bass, and other loud genres. The producers of those genres weren't paying attention to the forum nerds. They were just forging their own path and having fun while doing it. But of course, there are other genres like ambient, downtempo, indie, and chill, which may be an exception to this rule. A lot of those styles may benefit from an analog type workflow where the sounds aren't over-clipped, over-compressed, over-limited, and whatever else. Plus, a lot of these styles tend to use analog emulation plugins. And speaking of exceptions, we're going to dive into those now because this doesn't always apply. The first exception is that analog style plugins often mimic the workflow of analog consoles. Now, this means if I add a utility, I've turned off the other plugins we've got here and boost it up so that we're peaking at, say, around -1 to 0 dB, right? And I'll turn off this new plugin I just added. We're getting pretty close there to 0 dB. I turn on this CLA2A plugin, which is an analog emulation of the LA2A compressor. You'll notice it's already starting to compress the sound without me having much say. Now, obviously I can change the gain here, but this is actually output gain, right? And you can see this red LED lights up if I push it too hard. Now this peak reduction determines the amount of compression. And with hard notes that are closer to 0 dB, it's compressing the sound by default quite a lot. And you can see here it's clipping and that it doesn't have a lot of headroom to work with, which means that it's better for me to work around probably closer down here, so turning off the utility, where I can manage the exact peak reduction with flexibility and to get the desired sound I want. Now this may mean working at quite a volume from the output of your synth, your drums, or whatever thing you're applying analog processing to, but it also means you can just grab a utility like I've just done now, adjust the volume going into that plugin, and then potentially even creating a second one where you adjust it out of the plugin like so. And that will circumnavigate any gain staging errors that have been made along the way. Generally, analog plugins work in that realm of -18 dBFS to -6 dBFS, but you want to check the manual for each plugin to make sure what you're doing is correct. The second thing is that recording is still analog. You want to make sure that you're not clipping or having too noisy of a signal when you're recording a microphone like this or another instrument, because once you've recorded that, it's going to be baked into the signal. And yes, there are repair stuff you can do to it, but again, it's better to fix it at the source. So your audio interface is going to determine how that sounds. So don't clip there and you'll be sweet. Third exception is obviously something I've mentioned throughout, but you should never export something over 0 dB. This includes stems, the master channel, or whichever else. Once it's exported over 0 dB in a format that doesn't support headroom over 0 dB, it's going to distort and it's going to sound bad. So you want to avoid doing that at any possible point. While you have the flexibility within the DAW environment on the individual channels, the final thing that reaches your ears mustn't clip. And lastly, number 4, digital clipping is actually worse. Whereas on the old consoles, clipping was kind of this soft, desirable effect. Digital clipping is actually quite harsh and brutal, often destroying mixes tremendously. So while it's harder to clip in the digital world, it's often worse when you do. So you do need to be careful. And those are the exceptions. And that is the gain staging workflow I recommend for producers in 2023 and beyond. You have to have that flexibility, but also pay attention to some of the exceptions where you still may have to use the old school rules, so to speak. But I hope this video has provided you with a more holistic understanding of how gain staging works, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. Again, if you're a new producer, this stuff is super important to get right from the beginning, but it's not the only thing. So make sure to grab our free masterclass, sign up for that, and you can watch it immediately. Over 10,000 producers have taken it, and it's really helped people put them on the right path and not get confused by the YouTube rabbit hole. Sign up for that. And as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye.